Afternoon. I'm Linda Baker, the Learning Director at the Center for the Research and Education on Violence Against Women and Children. And with me today, I have Diane Lalonde, one of our research associates at the Center, who works along with the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub. The rest of our team are employed in other stations, helping to make this webinar a success. And on behalf of our whole team, I would like to welcome everyone today. Wherever you are on Turtle Island today, please join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous peoples. We are bringing today's webinar from the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub. We are excited to have Yamikani and Msosa join us again for today's webinar, Roots and Resilience, Exploring Healing-Centered Engagement and Pleasure with Black Survivors of Sexual Violence. Many of you will know and will have been present when Yami presented a webinar for us last May on anti-Black racism and sexual violence. And the response we got from that webinar was outstanding. And one of the common comments was, we'd like to hear more from this presenter. And so today, Yami is going to continue the conversation by exploring practices of resiliency that exist for Black survivors of sexual violence. For those of you who weren't able to join us last May, the recording of Yami's previous webinar is posted on our website, and you will find the link for it in the chat box. Before I introduce Yami, I will just go through our webinar format. And some of what I'm going to share is on the slide that you see on your screen. So the basic format is that Yami will present for 1 hour approximately. And during her presentation, we invite you to share any questions or comments that you may have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And Diane and I will track those, and then for the last 15 minutes from 2 o'clock to 2:15, we'll present as many of your questions as we can to Yami for her response. At the end of the webinar, in the chat box, you will see a link to the evaluation. We really value the responses that people provide to us through the evaluations. They help us plan for future webinars, to know who to invite back, and what kinds of topics that you want to hear more about or about for the first time in our series. Once you complete the evaluation form, you will be directed to a web page where you will be prompted to enter your full name and email address. And at that time, a certificate of participation will be generated and emailed to you. And I just want to stress that even though your email address goes in order to get your certificate, it's not linked to your evaluation. So your evaluation is anonymous, but the name triggers the production of the participation certificate. Yami's kindly agreed to allow her presentation slides to be posted on our website, and there's a link in the chat box right now. And Yami tells us that there'll be a slightly updated version that will be available later, and that will be placed on our website. The webinar recording will be posted on our website within the next few days. And once posted, an email will be sent out to all those who've registered for this webinar so that they can access it, listen to it again, or provide the link to friends that they wish had heard Yami present. We also wanted just to let you know that Sarah has put a link to the rest of our upcoming webinar series in the chat box for those of you who may be joining us for the first time today. So with that, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Yami back. For those of you meeting Yami for the first time, Yami is a grassroots feminist, anti-violence educator, consultant, and movement-based practitioner. She has worked for a number of anti-violence organizations, including Sexual Assault Support Center of Ottawa, Ryerson's Consent Comes First office, and Immigrant Women's Services of Ottawa. Yami currently sits on the Youth Advisory for the Equality Project at Ottawa University, which is a partnership of scholars, research and policy institutes, policymakers, educators, community organizations, and youth. And their purpose is to address privacy, cyber violence, and gender-based violence. In 2017, Yami founded Seeds Yoga, a program that uses yoga and movement to support those affected by sexual violence. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Yami. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to do a quick check-in here. Can folks hear me okay? Sarah, you could let me know if there's any issues. Fabulous. Okay. All right, so we're going to get right into it. Thank you, Linda, for that introduction. And thank you for acknowledging, doing the land acknowledgement. And I want to do it again, just to make note that I'm currently on unceded, unsurrendered Indigenous lands. And for folks to think about what it means that we're here today and to show gratitude, not only to the local communities, Indigenous communities within where you're residing and knowing who they are. For myself, I'm in the Dish with One Spoon territory. And as a settler impacted by colonization, I was brought here as a refugee due to the fact that there was displacement in my country of origin. I still continuously think about the ways in which I am complicit to the ongoing violence that Indigenous communities face here on Turtle Island, as well as the ways in which I can act in solidarity, mainly noting also that if we talk about gender-based violence or sexual-based violence, we cannot divorce those conversations from ongoing colonization, ongoing land theft of Indigenous communities, and that we must act in solidarity from an intersectional perspective and recognize how our liberation is all bound in one. So I'm going to be looking down just because I'm sharing my screen with you lovely folks. And so to reference some of my notes. So if you wonder why I keep doing that, that is why. So in terms of a presentation outline, I'll do some acknowledgements because I think it's important for me to recognize that I didn't get here by virtue of just being, that there are many key folks that have influenced my learning and my ability to share knowledge with you. And that nothing that I share is actually new, right? That it's come from somewhere, and that cyclical path of knowledge and knowledge sharing, and acknowledging those folks that have been part of that journey with me. I'll do a short recap of roots and resistance, talking about some frameworks of reference that are important for folks who haven't had the opportunity to see the webinar from last year. And then we'll be going into healing center engagement, as well as looking at pleasure in reference to healing and the different possibilities and programs. And what I'll say, and I'll probably repeat this later, is that when looking at the practices of healing-centered engagement, not only as a facilitator, but also as a participant, and so being able to share some of what I experienced and learned from the programs that I participated in and the work that they're doing, which is not particularly focused on sexual violence, but is of benefit to survivors of sexual violence. So coming to the acknowledgements, some of the names on this list you will know. It's been a journey. I've been doing this work for about 10 years now. And along that journey, from the tender age of 19, being able to be supported and held by different folks, whether it be through opening a book and reading the words of Kimberly Crenshaw or Audre Lorde or Bell Hooks, to having conversations face-to-face with some of the people, Jacqueline Ben-John, Sidra, Concilia, Egla Martinez, who have really influenced the ways in which I see the world and the work that we do to create a world that is liberated and free from sexual violence. So in terms of my journey, it was shared a bit. So I've been supporting survivors for about 10 years now in various capacities. And I want to make note that I am not an expert. The knowledge that I have is from my own experience as a survivor, but also from the privilege of working with survivors over the years. And I think it's important to centralize that and say that while I do know a lot, that there are gaps in my knowledge. And part of this webinar, I'm hoping, is also to learn from you in terms of participants and being able to share some things that may come up for you, whether it's resources, because again, our liberation is collectively bound. And if we are looking at a world that is free of gender-based violence or ending sexual violence, we need to work collectively together. And so making note of the fact that 10 years of collective experience in this area, I currently am working with the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center as an advocate and counselor, as well as was mentioned, working with survivors using movement-based practices. And how that came to be, I'll share a bit more when talking about healing-centered engagement using movement-based practices, but was really thinking about how do we center joy and how do we move outside of talk therapy when it comes to supporting, which is not a new concept at all. It's something that I know that when I entered into the movement, 10 plus years ago, that these conversations were happening. And so a lot of what I like to say is that there's different language, right? Different frameworks that are emerging that allows us to have that practical application. But the ideas in themselves are not new. Some of them are, from time immemorial. So making note of that as well. Okay. So recapping from Roots and Resistance, in that webinar, I talked about misogynoir and being able to define what misogynoir is, and I'll do that in a moment, and the different archetypes and stereotypes that Black women and femmes face. And this includes trans women, non-binary, feminized folks. So making note of the ways in which racialization, sexualization, gender all play a role in those experiences. I talked about the realities and possibilities, mainly naming some programming, which you can go back to that webinar and see, and exploring the statistics of Black survivors of sexual violence. One thing I do want to make note of is that there are gaps within Canadian research. So there isn't not relevant, but there isn't as the data isn't there, right, for Black survivors of sexual violence, the ways in which it is in the States. So some of the data I will be referencing is from the National Coalition, the National Sexual Violence Coalition in the States. And, just thinking about, researchers who may be watching this, ways in which we can close those gaps to ensure that we're providing a more holistic paradigm and picture of survivors of sexual violence. So a lot of the things that some of the stories that I'll be sharing are anecdotal, and I do have consent to be sharing those stories as well. In the last webinar, also talked about systems of failure around mainstream gender-based violence movements. And this was really in tandem with the over-reliance of the criminal justice system when it comes to supporting survivors, as well as looking at institutional barriers for survivors, Black survivors of gender-based violence, racialized survivors of gender-based violence. And in that, particularly examining the ways in which not only the state perpetuates violence against Black bodies and brown bodies, but also the ways in which mainstream gender-based violence organizations facilitate violence towards women who are seeking and folks who are seeking supports, whether that be through narrowing of policies that are transphobic, to the ways in which the shelter system mimics the prison industrial complex, and other ways also looking at the ways in which apprehension rates and gender-based violence, how those rates are in tandem as well. And in Ontario, I can't speak for the rest of Canada, looking at the overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous bodies within the child welfare system. And so it was really exploring some of those dimensions and looking at the gaps that currently exist, and really, quite frankly, painting a very, it's a real picture, but a quite morbid picture of the realities of survivors. And as someone who worked within a sexual assault center for about 8 years, and also had the privilege of working with other sexual assault centers, knowing that there was a consistent gap in terms of being able to outreach and having survivors come into the space, but also recognizing that there was a gap within organizations in being able to have workers that actively represented communities, right? And so coming to the definition of misogynoir, I think it's important to bring that back to highlight, and I'm not going to go through the whole definition, but what I am going to say is it was a term coined by Moya Bailey, I believe in 2010. And the realities of misogynoir, I think, are not only in action, right? So it's not only about the overt violence that's faced by Black women and Black femmes, but also referring to the inaction when it comes to the contribution of Black women and the erasure of their experiences, and Black trans women and Black non-binary folks, and the erasure of the contribution. There's so many times, just a key example of the ways in which the term intersectionality has been popularized, but rarely do folks actually credit the root of where that framework, where that practice came from, which is Kimberly Crenshaw. And so being able to look at the definition of, misogynoir, and coming back to it, it was published in the Crunk Feminist Collective, and the article's still up. So I would encourage you to take some time and read the article, but it is this juxtaposition, right? Not only to white women or to white folks around the degradation of Black women or Black folks being seen as other, or the invisibility of Black women's pain, or the hypervisibility of the flaws of Black womanhood or Black femininity, and how it is punished. And it specifically names it in the context of anti-Black racism, right? And I think that's important because often, when we talk about gender-based violence, when we talk about sexualized forms of violence, there needs to be a deviation of experiences, right? We've been saying it from time that, one size fits models in terms of supporting survivors do not fit, right? That looking at difference is an important catalyst in being able to provide tangible support, and also being able to recognize where you may not get it, or I may not get it, et cetera. So, and of course, being able to look at it from an intersectional perspective and recognizing that Blackness is not a monolith, femininity is not a monolith, and we know that disproportionately Black trans women are being murdered and killed, and that influx of sexism, gender-based violence, and how we name gender-based violence and anti-Black racism. This past month, Malaysia Booker, Claire Legato, Michelle Simmons were killed. Violent deaths in North America and the States particularly. And we know that these experiences exist here in Canada, whether it be with Samaya Delmar. And we know that, and that we know that we must continually center the voices of Black trans women and femmes of color in conversations about gender-based violence and sexual violence, and look at the ways in which we are invisibilizing folks, whether it be within our organization, within the conversations that we have, the use of women, which women are we talking about, who are we talking about when we're talking about survivorship. So being able to bring that front and center. We also talked about the archetypes. So looking at the different archetypes that often, when working with survivors, and most recently, you know, I have permission, I was working with a survivor who I'll name as Elle, and she was sharing how the archetype or the stereotype, or however you want to frame it, of the Jezebel was continuously, was a catalytic part of why she experienced violence. And the mammy aspect was the reason why she struggled to find support. So it was interesting navigating that conversation with this individual, and them saying, you know, everyone thinks that, you know, I don't need caring for, and that I'm a caregiver within my community. And, you know, the ways and also talking about the ways in which she was hypersexualized as a Black femme. And how bringing those frameworks and concepts into the conversation was almost like a light bulb moment of like, oh yeah, totally. That's exactly how I feel like I'm situated, or how people see me, or how my experience is situated. And it's not to say that these are totalitarian archetypes or stereotypes. We know that they're multidimensional, right? And are definitely contextual. But what they do provide is language. And I find when working with Black survivors to be able to say, and again, those who are femme and who identify as women, allows them to have the language to be able to identify those experiences through that lens. It's also important, I think, to acknowledge, and I didn't include this in the last webinar, is to center conversations around Black masculinity and the hypersexualization that Black men face. And, you know, we were inundated for the, you know, the last year around the Me Too movement, around Time's Up, around, you know, the stories of R. Kelly, and, you know, the conversations coming forward around, you know, Black men are survivors too. And I think that is a completely valid point, and one in which sometimes that I recognize the disproportionate rate of women that are subject to sexual violence and femme folks that are subject to sexual violence, but that it's not an all or nothing, and being able to recognize the ways in which Black men, the hypermasculinity does prevent them from coming forward around their experiences of sexual violence, and how often myths around sexual violence are perpetuated with them as well, right? Oh, well, look at Terry Crews, you know, he was a big dude, football player, NFL, you know, and he was groped, right? And the countless stories that I hear of, you know, Black male survivors who are afraid to come out and talk about their experiences because of that demasculinization, right? So looking at the way masculinity impacts men as well, right? This violent cycle. So being able to bring that in the forefront, and I thought it was important to make note of that this webinar as well. So this came out after the webinar last year, and I love, and I can't say it enough, I love this infographic, because it really does encapsulate the ways in which you know, sexual violence, and they specifically use rape here, and I would extend it to sexual violence that Black survivors face. And so this was created by Sasha Center, which is in Detroit, and it was a sexual assault center for holistic healing that was founded in Detroit by a survivor, and is predominantly led by Black women and Black men, Black folks, I should just say. And they're doing some really amazing work. And they actually have a whole 90-minute webinar breaking down this infographic, talking about it from a nuanced perspective, giving anecdotal experiences. So I would encourage you, maybe what I'll do in the resources that we share at the end is include the link to that webinar, because it's phenomenal. Excuse me. But what we see here is a lot of what I've already been talking about in terms of the over-sexualization of Black bodies, in terms of the ways in which rape culture is facilitated and reperpetuated. And an interesting one that often comes up is cultural appropriation, and thinking about the ways in which music and popular culture contributes to how we understand rape culture and the way that it's normalized within society. Systemic barriers, I talked about it in the recap, the ways in which institutional systems, such as criminal justice systems, such as mainstream GBV movements, facilitate secondary violence towards survivors who are seeking help. And so it's broken up into 4 parts, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it does provide a landscape in which we start to think about, again, moving away from that one-size-fits-all models. And I wish that we could have this for, multiple identities, to be able to really think intentionally about, okay, so what support services would make sense, right? For survivors, being able to look at the different ways that sexual violence is experienced. And again, this is, not treating Black people or Black folks as a monolith, but also being intentional around ableism, sex, homophobia, transphobia, and how all of those would play a different role in the ways in which experiences, or in the ways that survivors' experiences come forward. Okay. And lastly, the statistics, we know here that 40% of survivors have experienced sexual violence by the age of 18. Trans women of color, specifically also Black trans women, are more likely to experience sexual violence and gender-based violence than cis women, and Black women are less likely to report experiences of sexual violence. And so all of this presents, quite a grim picture, right? Like I said earlier, we know that there's a problem, and we know that, we have to, I can't say we all are, but we have to continuously be thinking about the ways in which we can support Black survivors. And so my entry point into this webinar was thinking about, okay, I've been doing this work for 10 years. We know that survivors need support. We know that Black survivors are not going to sexual assault centers, are not going to mainstream services, are finding other ways to support themselves. So how do we infuse, where do we begin with this, right? And I really wanted to start thinking about how do we move away from deficit models? When I think of, the term marginalized groups, or when I think about the terms of underrepresented groups, it does already have an underpinning of deficit there. And a lot of the time when working with survivors, they'll say to me, don't feel sorry for me, right? Like, don't pity me. I'm coming to you because, I'm accessing something, but how do we move away from the disenfranchisement models that I would argue are a part of maintaining supremacy over, right? And being able to say you are still less than, and recognizing that in many ways, and this is something a lovely elder shared with me, is that in many ways, communities have been taking care of themselves in multiple ways prior to us being able to document it. And in fact, it doesn't look, it doesn't mirror mainstream ways of doing, whether it be social work or therapy or et cetera, and that resistance and healing has its own modalities within our community. And said to me, certainly, make no mistake. And so being able to think about that exactly, that we've had practices that continuously have existed within our communities, and then me being me, and seeking and thinking about, and engaging in conversations about centering joy and strength-based practices when it comes to working with Black survivors of sexual violence. That's where we land here today. And I love this quote because it's, again, that mirroring of what that survivor shared with me, and saying, I am more than what happened to me. I am not just my trauma, right? And really being able to think about it as a frontline worker and as someone who's been doing this work for some time now, about, oh yeah, you're absolutely right. You're more than just your trauma, right? Walking through the door, there are labels that, you have identified as a survivor, but you're more than that. You had a life before that, and you will have a life after that, right? And so when when I was introduced to healing-centered engagement, it was actually from a survivor who had said to me, I really appreciate this frameworks of trauma-informed care that you're putting forth, and that everyone's talking about it as a buzzword. But have you ever heard of healing-centered approaches to support? And I was like, oh, let's take a look at this, right? And what I want to make note of is that healing-centered approaches or engagement is not a new concept. It's something that we've been talking about, at least in spaces that I've been, strength-based perspectives in supporting survivors for years, right? But again, it's the framework, the tangibility of the framework that we have now, and something that, I wanted to share in moving away from deficit models and strength and moving towards strength-based models for Black survivors of sexual violence. And for folks that are working with different communities, thinking about the ways that you also can, if you're not already applying these practices. So with healing-centered engagement, it's looking at an ecosystem of healing, right? So it is asking the questions around, from the perspective of going from, what is wrong with you, to trauma-informed care, which is asking what happened to you, to healing-centered engagement, which is asking what's right with you, right? And often, that question of what's right with you is one that can take people aback, right? But healing-centered engagement is about, and this quote here from Sean Ginbright, is looking at how folks can be agents of their own well-being rather than victims of traumatic events. And I think this is so key when, folks that I work with and have worked with are experiencing sexual violence, but also experiencing anti-Black racism and other, other factors, right? And so being able to really pull that in. And so it's strength-based. It's collective. It's about collective healing, and it's political rather than clinical. And I think this is important. One, because I don't think I mentioned this, but I'm not a clinical social worker, right? I'm a public educator. I'm a movement-based practitioner. I do provide frontline peer support and advocacy, but I don't provide counseling in the traditional psychotherapy sense. And what I loved about healing-centered engagement and talking about the fact that it's political rather than clinical is coming back to, the fact that our movement started as political reactionary, statements around ending sexual violence or ending gender-based violence, and that the clinical and therapeutic supports have been super beneficial, right, to being able to support survivors, but that there is a political element, right, to survivors advocating for survivors. And that's what I've really been able to see within the spaces that I've been in the programs that I've been able to participate, is that the strength-based of, I am not a victim here, or yes, I've had these traumatic experiences, and yes, I'm dealing with it, in whether it be with a social worker or whatever, but there's this other element of being able to show and represent myself in a way that is counter to narratives of deficit models that are out there. Okay. Just a quick note check here. Okay. So in being able to look at the ways in which healing-centered engagement, and being able to look at the ways in the ecosystems of healing, and knowing that ecosystems of healing involve community, right? They involve different aspects of people coming together to do resistance work, but that doesn't always necessarily centralize the experiences of necessarily sexual violence and the experiences that I have working with survivors. And so when thinking about these things, in the last year, and Adrienne Marie Brown has been talking about this for quite some time, and I do want to thank Farah Khan for introducing me to Adrienne Marie Brown, but around pleasure activism. And Adrienne Marie Brown has a whole subsection where she talks about pleasure and healing. She doesn't label it healing-centered engagement, but for the purposes of this webinar. And I'm like, this is healing-centered engagement, where she challenges us to look at healing from sexual violence from a different paradigm, from looking at it from infusing joy and pleasure, from looking at it from approaching the concepts of yes. And as a Black woman, she dares us to look at the ways in which having community and other people around us and being able to have ongoing conversations and honest conversations about healing processes, and asking us to indulge and survivors to indulge in yes. And often with the trauma-informed practices, it's what are your boundaries? What are your no's, right? And with this practice, it's what are your yeses? What feels good? What do you need from community, right? Or how can community serve you? And so she dares us to get in touch with our own needs to organize against oppression. And this framework, and in speaking to her, really, I think, highlights the ways in which it's difficult for us as frontline workers, because we're always coming against, looking at resistance from a negative, not a negative way, but in a way that can feel heavy at times, can feel like it's coming from a deficit models of what we don't have, as opposed to looking at what we do have. And so that's challenging us to look at what we do have. And just another quote here, there's no way to repress pleasure and expect liberation or satisfaction or joy. So really challenging these frameworks. And, when watching the webinar, which I encourage you, with the executive director and founder for the Sexual Assault Center for Holistic Healing and Awareness in Detroit, Camila, with a group of other Black women, made the statement, right? Like, make no mistake, Black survivors have been resilient. They have been using modalities of healing outside of mainstream organizations. They have been meeting in kitchens, salons, churches. They have found ways to support their healing, make no mistake. And what this really calls attention to is, and what I've modeled through my program in Seeds is being able to meet folks where they're at, where healing is already happening, where community is already happening, where joy is already happening. And I know for certain folks in different institutions, this may not be possible. So it's also about thinking outside of the box in terms of what's already happening within your communities. And so in looking at practices of resilience, I'm going to be focusing on two specific areas, which is expressive arts and movement-based practices. So these are programs that currently exist. And I know people are always like, everything's always in Toronto. I'm sorry, that's where I'm located now. So that's the spaces in which I have access to. So the first one I'm going to talk about, and quite frankly, has high populations of Black folks who are doing resistance work, right? And so the two programs I am going to talk about, I have participated in, but also have witnessed how they've supported communities, within the GTA area, and how with one, which I'll explain has worked with the Toronto Rape Crisis Center. So the first is the Il Nana Dance Collective, and they have an intensive that they run. And one thing I want to make note of is that it is a BIPOC, LGBT, Black, Indigenous, people of color, led and focused group, right? And what it does is it brings in, and talking about healing-centered engagement, looking at communities, looking at a holistic approach, looking at ecosystems, it brings in conversations about social location in a way where it's allowing people, the entry point isn't trauma, right? The entry point is dance. The entry point is expression. And what they do is they allowed us to explore historical connection to dance and community. And through that, conversations of sexual violence, of trauma came up, right? It was a neutral space in which it wasn't in a sexual assault, it wasn't in a sexual assault center, it was in a community-based center, right? There was a clinical counselor on site that, if anything did come up, folks had access to supports. It was about expressive arts therapy, which I'm sure a number of you probably way more versed and well-versed than I am in the use of expressive arts. But it provided a holistic approach where there was the check-ins, there was the conversations around trauma and experiences, and a lot of it actually came through. But that, again, it wasn't the central point. So coming back to Kamala's point around, make no mistake, we've been meeting in churches, salons, kitchens, and that, this is a community center, but that these places of congregation have been spaces of healing, right? And that healing has been the core of it, even though it hasn't necessarily always been named of it. And so, there were times where questions were asked of us about exploring frameworks of joy, right? Exploring frameworks of what it means to express our yeses and what our yeses were unapologetically. And if we think about, survivors' experiences of being silenced, this was a real key way to allow people to explore consent-based practices within art expressive therapy. And what was beautiful also was the facilitators modeled and reflected the community, right? So there were trans, queer, people of color, Black folks who were facilitating these sessions. And so the facilitator participant dynamic was also it enabled us to provide a more a peer-based model, but also one in which that didn't have that hierarchy, right? Inherently, there's always hierarchies, but there was that shared experience, right? That communal experience in coming back to looking at healing-centered engagement and being able to ask the question of what was right with you. What do you need? How can we support you, right? And having a showcase at the end where people were able to show their joy, their passion, and have a whole community around them to support them on that journey. The next is Body Love, and this is the program which is run at the TRCC by Dainty Smith. And again, this does have also, a focus for communities of color, but it uses burlesque as a tool and a movement, and movement as a tool to support healing. So it asks questions about touch. And touch with self, right? It does use expressive arts therapy. And there's a political element to it, right? It's a reclaiming of femininity, of sexuality, in a safe way that allows survivors to explore, right? And for myself, as someone who went through the program and identifies as a survivor and other survivors within the program, it really allowed us to get comfortable with ourselves. And when we think about the hypersexualization of Black survivors and the ways in which we are automatically, I remember being in sessions, and I do want to say it's very odd for me to share this because I'm usually very private in terms of my experiences, but I do want to break down that expert survivor narrative that often comes up. But, as a Black woman navigating the world, a Black queer woman navigating the world, and knowing that my body is consistently commodified and hypersexualized, and everywhere I go, I see it, whether it be within mainstream media. The ability to ask myself and to reclaim that that element of sexuality, using movement, using burlesque, which is something that, some people would frown upon. But what it did, it provided an entryway to say, yes, this is what I want to do, and this is what I want to show, and this is how I want to express my body. In a sexual way, right? Which also brought questions around consent within the bedroom, right? Practices of consent within the bedroom. There was also, in building community, and we had lots of conversations about what it meant for folks to engage, with our sexuality in an overt way, in a way of reclaiming it, but also looking at other emotions like joy, happiness, and having a community of support, and being able to actively choose which emotions to engage with, which practices to engage with, and how that modeled in the outside world was absolutely phenomenal in day-to-day practices. So I don't know why the slide's here. I'm just going to skip over it. So in Seeds Yoga, being able to be a facilitator, kind of flipping hats now, and being able to think about healing-centered engagement, thinking about the yes, thinking about what's going right with me. There was a rebirth of how to support survivors. And for one area that often Black folks meet at is a hair salon, right? So it's a place of, we go, we sit, it's the hair studio I go to, and I sit in Kwame's chair and he takes really good care of me. And it's such a beautiful thing to then be able to transfer that into a space of community healing that already is engaging in a political action of Black joy, of Black liberation, to then translate that to a space where folks who are affected and intentionally using that language, affected in whatever way, and also if you don't identify, I don't like, as a facilitator, it really is very loose with that labeling, to come and practice yoga. And I do want to say that my training is with Zabi Yami, who is the founder of Transcending Yoga for Survivors of Sexual Violence. I'm using the tools that she gave me around trauma-informed care and taking it one step further, and asking and bringing in the practices of healing center engagement. So the mere fact that it's in a hair salon, and we ran a 4-week cycle, and we'll be running another 4-week cycle in the fall, as well as one at Union Yoga, which is not for Black survivors. It's a generalized group. But in that, having people come in who would never, ever, ever, ever engage in, and who have said to me, like, yeah, yoga, not a thing, Yami, movement-based stuff, not a thing, but will come because it's in a salon, because it's in a safe place that already exists, a place where they have honest conversations around mental health, around experiences of sexual violence, around the joys of what's going on in their life, and that unabashedly communal support. And like I said, as an act of Black liberation and joy, being able to provide that space for them, that movement space, and giving them the tools that they can utilize on a practical level, whether that's through emotional regulation when things come up, or just being able to say, hey, this happened to me, and this is how I dealt with it. Oh, shoot, I don't feel alone either, right? And so at the end of, every yoga session, I have what I call kitchen table talks, right? Because kitchen tables is where stuff goes down in community. I think of my aunties coming together around a table, talking all sorts of mess, and having those honest and difficult conversations in community through kitchen table time. And bringing in and infusing an element of spirituality, right, for folks, which, within community, that looks differently. And when I say spirituality, that could be religious, and that could not be religious, but allowing that to be infused within the practice, and really emphasizing the ways in which resiliency is built through that. So, we have about 13 minutes left, and I want to leave some time for questions. But, these are just practices and things that I have come into account within communities, and there's way more practices of engagement. Last week, I was at Inviting Resilience in Kawartha in Peterborough, and there were a number of organizations in Alberta, Indigenous-led organizations that are doing amazing work within their communities, and folks in Toronto, and really want to encourage folks to think about, what does the work look like in your communities? How do you move away from prescriptive models of healing that take an intersectional perspective, that are led by those who are impacted? And is this already happening in your community, and how can you support? And I recognize, again, for mainstream institutions such as post-secondary spaces, this may be a difficult thing to have to negotiate because of the models in which you exist in. So my question is to you: are you doing the research to see what's in your communities and existing out there to make those reference points? And how are we centering joy, right, within the practices, and being able to do that as well? So I'm going to bring Adrienne Marie Brown back in here. who talks about pleasure and joy and all those pieces. And we laugh, we cry, we bring all those emotions in supporting, in my experience in supporting survivors of sexual violence. And in one last class that I had, we talked about how feeling good is not frivolous, it's actually freedom. And for Black people to feel free, for Black people to feel liberated, for Black people to feel pleasure is an act of resistance against colonial, white supremacist, heteropatriarchy society. And so I'm going to end there with my contact information, and thank everyone for taking time to, share this time with me and listen to me talk, to be honest, for the last 15 minutes. And I guess now we'll open up time for questions. And Sarah and Linda, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, thank you, Yami. We really appreciate your presentation. And we do have some questions that have started to come in.
Am I able to see them? If I auto-populate them, will they come up on the screen?
Yes, you'll see them at the side.
Okay. Should I not do that?
You can if you want.
Okay.
One of the things that is maybe an easy place to start is some of the sort of specifics in the sense of with the examples you gave, such as body love, roughly how many people would be present that at a time in the group? And would the same people, is it more of a closed community, or can people come in throughout? Like I come this week, but next week I don't come, etc.
Yeah, no, it's a closed group. 10, I think max 10 participants, and it runs for about 6 weeks.
It's 6 weeks. One of the other sort of practical questions was when you were talking about seeds, how did you identify the length of time for the cycles, the 4 weeks that you mentioned? How did you identify that?
Trial and error. I think that most folks tend to fizzle out around the 4-week mark. And this is something that is contextual to time and space for folks that here in Ontario, the fall months seem to be a bit heavier in terms of folks wanting to do programming versus the springtime. I have offered seeds, I'll be honest, I have offered seeds as one-offs in different communities across the country. And what I found, and that was this actually initial practice, was I was like, okay, I'm going to do these trauma-informed classes for Black survivors, and they're going to, just be these one classes that happen once a month. And what I found was it didn't work. There needed to be that continual commitment and practice. And part of that was for building community. And part of that was also to be able to explore some of the thematic practices and frameworks. There's only so much time that we would be able to designate to like kitchen table talks, right?
Right.
So part of that was being able to extend time for survivors. And also, like, I remember when person sharing with me saying, like, time's a colonial concept, Yami, like we need to be able to expand it. And I was like, okay, well, we can't stay here the whole afternoon, which is something that would happen in community and with family, right? So there still are boundaries and the ways in which it is delivered. But I found multi-week, and it may shift and change, and that's the beauty of it, right? 2 years from now, it may be an 8-week program. The way that Sabi Yamiaski has it set up is that it is an 8-week program. And I just found that was too much for folks, and that smaller doses worked. So.
Okay. Another question, what can I do to create a more welcoming space for Black survivors of sexual violence in a more traditional clinical environment?
Ooh. Oh yeah. How do you create a more, okay. So I think the first point of departure, and I'm going to speak bluntly because I care, is to ensure that you yourself have the awareness around, if you are not someone that identifies as Black, I see another question coming up. I'm just gonna, sorry, distractions. So the first point of departure is being able to identify, has your team gone through anti-Black racism training? I remember doing a training for Pinecrest Queensway Community Health Center, where we trained all of their social workers on anti-Black racism. And it was a 3-day training, right? I think that there's often this idea of wanting to create welcoming space, but part of welcoming space is the recognition that microaggressions are going to happen, and looking at the ways in which to mitigate that, right? And so if I'm thinking of a university space just to begin with, or a college space to begin with, do you have folks that are reflective of the community, but it doesn't necessarily need to stop there? Is your team aware of how microaggressions are experienced? Is your team aware of how anti-Black racism and sexual violence, how they're experienced in tandem? Is your team aware of relevant supports within community that you can refer to? Your space doesn't always need to be it could be the point of contact, but it doesn't need to be the ending point where survivors are getting support. So what does it look like to be able, and in Toronto, there's so many spaces in which, folks can be referred to that, I would just name off the top of my head and say, hey, do you know X, Y, Z that you can access? And then I think also being able to look on a practical level at the ways in which you're marketing your program. And I say that to say that there's been spaces that I've been in that, all of their material is white people, white cis people, or images of white hetero folks. And those things do play a role, right? Like those physical markers do play a role in folks being able to feel welcome. So those are just some preliminary things that I would say and name to begin with, in terms of making the space more welcoming. And I think also just, doing a survey, a climate survey, and asking your service users or your clients, however you frame it, how are we doing around these areas, which can be really scary and really vulnerable, but I think is also really important to be able to have that two-way streak of being able to say, this is how we feel better, this is how we do better.
Thank you, Yami. Another question, how are people using outdoors and nature in this work? And especially when you talk about finding the joy and some of those pieces.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you say that, because the most recent cycle of seeds that we had, a couple of folks were just like, we want to be outside and we don't want to be indoors. And it brings me to think of some of the work that Adrienne Marie Brown talks about and the healing nature of the outdoors. And there's a chapter in which I'll encourage you to read where a survivor and someone who's going through a traumatic experience actually sits outside in the earth and, not to get too explicit, but places, her nude body on the earth and just allows the earth to heal her, right? And just the storytelling of it was so incredibly powerful. And it is a consistent reminder that, being in a concrete jungle like myself, that nature has its healing elements and its healing qualities that we consistently must go to. And so definitely, I think being able to incorporate some of those practices in terms of nature walks and touching the trees and touching the grass and giving thanks, which is something that I've learned through most Indigenous, elders and community members that I've had contact with is being able to be in nature and nature's healing qualities. Just even thinking about, yesterday, when I was given cedar tea, and how that was presented as something with immense healing qualities, whether it be through antioxidants, et cetera, but also taking cedar baths and all of those elements. So knowing that nature is a healer in itself. So yeah, I don't know if that answered your question. So
it wasn't my question, but I trust that it did. And this question, it could be someone reading our minds. The comment is, I love the question, what is right with you?
Mm-hmm.
And the follow-up to that, their real question is, have you ever been in a situation where someone really struggled with or was actually unable to identify what was right with them?
Yes.
And what would better serve them in sense of community, and how might you handle that? What would be your thoughts about supporting someone who's really struggling with that?
Oh gosh, yes. I'm laughing because I myself I'm guilty of it. And I think it's affirming that, access to joy, especially when we've experienced a number of traumatic events, access to joy is not something that is readily accessible. I remember asking this question a couple years ago to a survivor, and she's like, nothing. So I was like, okay, nothing. That's we meet survivors where they're at, right? And it could be in that moment that joy is not something that they're able to access, and being able to hold space for that in intentional ways, and not pressure people into, this modality of like, everyone, you have to be happy and pleasurable. Because I think one of the beautiful things about centering joy and pleasure in our journeys is that we do that because we know pain, because we know harm. And so it provides a scope where, if you are in a neutral space and that's something that you can access, I want to acknowledge that, and I want to hold space for that, as someone who is your supporter, or your, counselor, or whatever role it was your friend, right? That it is okay if you can identify what's right with you. So let's just start there.
Mm-hmm. And are there specific things in terms of activities or experiences that you have found that might, over time, when the time is right, help someone to get in touch with or experience something that is right with them, or that brings them joy?
Yeah, I think that's very contextually based. I think when working with, different communities, it's going to look different, right? So I know that, the community, the cultural aspect, right? And then recognizing, for myself as someone who is from an African diasporic, specifically Malawi, that, something like coming together and cooking a meal, and having conversation is an activity that can spark so much joy, and so much communal healing, and something that, I actively do, but I know that, has been suggested to survivors. And that's tricky, because I recognize that not everyone has a community of support in the same ways. And sometimes folks are exiting family violence, and that is the reason why they don't have access to those communities of support. But how revitalizing that can be, right? I think of, in the number of iftars that are being held right now, because Ramadan is coming, and because Eid is coming, and the ways that can act as a support of communal healing. So I think it is really contextual to space and place. But again, thinking and asking, and exploring, is really what part of the work is. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Back to a more practical question, is there a cost to each program, and is that a barrier for people?
Yeah, so no, there's actually not a cost to each program. So most of them are accessible for free, with the exception of seeds, which most of the costs that I incur are just to cover space and place, but provide like a really low cost. So generally, trauma-informed, movement-based practice classes for a series of weeks would be upwards of $150, because of some fundraising and support from the community, and also just donation that I'm, specifically for Cs, I should say, have been able to keep the cost below $30 per session for survivors, for cycles, sorry. and then for Body Love and Ilnana Dance Collective. And there's similar programs such as Unity in Toronto that are for free and accessible, and that's mainly due because they're funded through different funding streams, whether it be provincial or federal or municipal.
Yeah. Yami,
and sorry, I should make mention, part of what makes it accessible is that there's food and that there's tokens and that there's all those other things that allow people to come and be present. So,
right. Mm-hmm. Yami, in your experience, are people more likely after experiences such as the programs you described to engage with more traditional services, such as those the support offered through a sexual assault center, or do they sometimes run parallel, or do you find that they're actually very distinct, and people either find a home and support in one pathway versus another?
Yeah, so to be quite frank, I think that they're very distinct. I think that most folks who are seeking such programs are doing so intentionally, mainly because others haven't worked. But, you know, I don't want to provide a totalitarian kind of like oversight of this is everyone's experience, because it's not. But yeah, it is for all intents and purposes an alternative that folks are seeking and looking for because they want something that's more connected to their communities, and one in which that represents them, their experiences, and also allows for a release and conversations around pleasure and joy. So, yeah.
You said most of your experience right now is in the Toronto area.
Yeah, I know. All the people outside of Ontario are like,
yeah. But the question is, what about, have you heard of any particular programs, or do you want to comment on what might be available in rural areas?
Yeah, that's one that I can't speak to, and that is a gap that I'm fully aware of, which is like across the board in terms of supports, because like even thinking about fly-in communities, right? Like what that would look like. No, I can't speak to any ones outside of Ontario. There were some programs that I was looking out east, but wasn't able to find substantial content to be able to share with you folks. And by out east, I mean in Halifax. And so, yeah, that is a shortcoming. And so this is where, you know, collective community, we come together and we share resources, and we email Linda and Sarah with resources that they can then share on their website, and being able to create some of and close some of those gaps.
Right. I was just thinking about how important community is, the collective experience in the programs that you've described, Yami. And I'm just wondering if after the facilitator is no longer offering that program, whether the community in an organic way tends to continue on.
Yeah, absolutely. Most definitely. I think relationships and community bonds are formed in ways that would allow for that. And that is what when we talk about survivor resiliency, and when we talk about being able to, have survivors support one another, which is, no longer have to rely on counseling or whatever, and building their own practices of resilience. That's what it's about. It is about them being able to continue. So it's like, yeah, absolutely does happen.
Okay. That would seem to be an important part of the model. Mm-hmm. Again, with no pressure, it's continue on or not.
Mm-hmm. And I think, part of what it makes me think of, and this is a hard truth, is how within the nonprofit industrial complex, how we do rely on, having survivors to support, even if it's coming from a well-intentioned space. And so, our goal is not to, recognizing that harm can happen at multiple times, but our goal is to have folks who are independently navigating and building their own practices of resilience that no longer need our services, right? And so it is a hard truth, right? That, if we are doing, the work will be, it will be amazing when folks no longer need our services or need these practices.
Mm-hmm.
Not these practices, but the services.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
The exact question, what would you recommend for a cisgendered white male who is trying to engage with a marginalized victim?
Okay.
Concerned about perceived barriers, concerned about things that, may be helpful versus things that may not.
I think, again, this is just context. I feel like this is contextually based, but just some things that come off the top of my head is being able to look at the ways in which you yourself are creating barriers for the survivor, right? And being able to identify and name that, right? Like there's something powerful in being able to for someone that's providing support. And I say this to survivors all the time, like, listen, like by social location as a queer Black woman, I do have economic privilege in the sense that I have a master's degree, a full-time job, all of those things that allow me to navigate the world in a very particular way. And I think naming that sometimes is of benefit. Sometimes it's not, depending on where the survivor's at, by saying, hey, we're walking on this journey together. And, this is the limited framework in which I'm coming from my social location. And I think using that as a point of departure, and again, doing the work of education and not relying on racialized communities to educate you. There's tons of resources out there. And I would encourage you to explore. There's work that's done by Insight Women of Color and Trans Women against violence. There's tons of scholarly articles and webinars like this one that explore what it means to support survivors from a culturally relevant perspective, or culturally competent perspective, I should say. And so I think that the fact that you're asking the question, the fact that you're thinking about that is actually the first step, because often folks aren't thinking about that. They're not thinking about how their social location impacts the ways in which they provide services, right? And being able to walk with whatever survivor you're working with and saying, hey, I'm going to make mistakes, I'm not perfect. Whew, let me tell you, it goes a long way. And so, again, that's the limited, advice for all intents and purposes I can give. But that the practices of self-reflexivity are so key. And I'm going to stop there.
Okay. Thank you. In terms of healing-centered engagement, there was a question, Yami, about, can you recommend, and if you want to send them to us and we'll put them up after, that's okay, but I just want to make sure it's on the table, is people are looking for more resources.
Yes, I have some webinars I can share. I have some readings I can share, so I'll definitely do that.
Okay, so I think people are interested and want to follow up
for sure
around that, so that would be wonderful. I wanted to end with not an easy question, I don't think.
Oh, no.
No, I think it's an important one, because I think that you've made the link between, which makes a lot of sense, deficit models and our omission, our failure to help people identify what's right and joy in their lives. Do you think, Yami, that there's more to it than, obviously the deficit framework is a critical piece, but do you think there's other reasons that's been a piece that, and is it true maybe of most areas, or is it specific to work with sexual violence? Any thoughts on that? And
I think when it comes to deficit models, I think the way that I see it is we were banging on the door saying, let us in, right? We deserve to be let in. And I think that is important and constructive work of my feminist for movement shakers and breakers is saying, hey, look at the gaps, look at, how we don't exist here. And I think, for me, being able to say, hey, wait, we do exist here and here and here and here, and look at the practices of resilience and look at the ways in which we're centralizing our own experiences has been extremely vital. And I don't think it's necessarily particular to the sexual violence movement. I think it's applicable to a number of different movements, and working and having a conversations with youth about pleasure activism and centering joy in the work that we do. A lot of them were saying, it's really hard because if you don't seem like you're operating from a point of fighting in deficit, then it doesn't seem like you're doing the work properly, right? And I'm like, what models have we created in which we're continuously burnt out, we're continuously fighting to exist, we're continuously banging our heads on funders' doors, on government's doors, which in Ontario, and saying like, hey, these are the issues that exist. It's just a different framing of it. And so I don't know if I'm answering your question or going on a tangent because it's a bit of a difficult one to answer, but, just to recap, yes, it doesn't only exist in sexual violence movements. It exists in other liberation movements in which we have been operating from, this is what's wrong with the world, and instead of saying this is what's right with the world. And this is what we've been doing to actively resist. And these are our practices of resilience and joy and activism. And I think that's what Adrienne Marie Brown is really calling us to do, right? Is to interrogate those ways and giving us tangible examples from harm reduction, right? To looking at sexual violence, to looking at land, to looking at cancer, to looking at all the ailments in which we do operate from this is what's wrong to looking at this is what's right, and how can we cultivate different frameworks of mind, which is really difficult to do. But that's why I encourage you all to read the book and explore that for yourself. And what's great in one of the slides, and I realized what it was there for, was to provide hot and heavy homework, is what she calls it within the book, to be able to explore and actually practically apply some of these things that we're challenged with in terms of centering pleasure and joy.
What a wonderful note to end in terms of centering joy and pleasure. And Yami, on behalf of our team and everybody in the audience that participated in this webinar, we just really want to thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll look forward to the next time that we have you share some of your thoughts and experience and a chance to talk with you. So
thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.